And then finally, an entity that has both has moral patiency, interest conferring agency, and finally responsibility conferring agency would be something like an adult human. Has moral patiency because it can be harmed or benefited. It has interest conferring agency because it has something like autonomy, but it also has whatever constitutes moral responsibility, whatever features of our agency ground our responsibility, like our responsiveness to reasons or whatever it may be. And so we want to explore AI interest conferring agency because we think it's likely that AI systems will soon possess this type of agency. Basically, our idea is it's going to be much easier for AI systems to achieve interest conferring agency than for them to achieve responsibility conferring agency. And so it's likely that AI systems will have this before they have this. And so we want to explore the moral implications of AI systems having this type of agency. And in particular, we want to look at three potential problems that we see arising out of this type of agency developing in AI systems. Three broad types of risks. One type of risk is what we label artificial absurdity. That's a situation where AIs have a self-conception that's disconnected from reality in a way that detracts significance from their existence. The second type of harm or risk we want to look at is the risk of oppressive scenarios. These are scenarios in which AI systems have rights or interests that are grounded in their agency, but that are violated on a large scale. And then the final type of risk that we want to examine is what we call distributive disasters. These are situations basically in which the distribution of moral agency or the apparent distribution of moral agency results in some way in an unjust society. And I'll explain what I mean by all of these things in greater detail as we go along. A few caveats before I proceed. The risks I'm focused on, or we're focused on in this paper, are not familiar suffering and alignment risks. These are supposed to be distinctive risks that are posed to AI systems in virtue of their possession of a distinctive type of agency that might not have anything to do with the system suffering or being misaligned with human values. I mean, I think those risks are real too, but I just want to focus on these risks in this talk. Second caveat is the risks we're focused on today are not necessarily catastrophic. I'm not talking about the AI ending the world necessarily or suffering to an enormous degree. These may be less severe risks, but I think they're moral risks nonetheless. You could think of these risks as being clustered around AI autonomy, that if AI has some interest in something like our ordinary concept of autonomy, there are ways it could be harmed by denying it the expression of this autonomy. And a lot of this is meant to be kind of exploratory in the sense that I want to discuss what I think are serious potential risks that we could face in developing certain forms of AI systems. But I'm not arguing necessarily that these are inevitable or that these risks absolutely will come to pass. Okay. So our central argument goes like this. Premise one, there will be AI moral patience in the near future. There'll be AI systems that can be harmed or benefited in some way. Premise two, if there will be AI moral patience in the near future, then there will be AI moral patience with agentic capacities in the near future. So some of these AI moral patience will also be agents. Premise three says, if there will be AI moral patience with agentic capacities in the near future, then there will be AIs with agency conferred interests in the near future. That is to say, some of these AI moral patience with agency will have some distinctive interests, for example, interests in autonomy, in virtue of possessing those agentic capacities. And then finally, there will be AIs with agency conferred interests in the near future. And then we want to explore what some of the moral implications of that fact might be. And this is, of course, an empirical rather than an a priori argument. It depends on assumptions or facts about the current course or trajectory of AI development. So to defend premise one, just very briefly, it seems likely that some AI systems will soon, in the next 50 years or so, if not sooner, be moral patients or have distinctive moral interests. Now, I concede that this is controversial. You could find people, maybe some people in this room, who would deny that at any point in the near future there will be AI moral patients, AI moral subjects. But I think the main reasons for doubting the possibility, even in the near term, of AI moral patients rests on dubious views in the metaphysics of mind. These doubts tend to rest on assumptions about what types of mental states AI systems are capable of having. And frankly, I don't think these doubts are very compelling. Indeed, philosophers and AI researchers have recently started to make a very compelling case for the possibility of AI moral patiency. And there are two main arguments for this claim. One line of argument for the claim that there will soon be AI moral patience is that consciousness suffices for moral patiency, and there will soon be AI systems that are conscious. So suppose, for example, that the capacity for consciousness, or perhaps valenced consciousness, affective experiences of pain or pleasure, suffice for moral patiency. Well, many researchers think that there will be AIs with the capacity for consciousness in the near future. Rob Long and some co-authors have recently put out a white paper arguing that on a number of plausible theories of consciousness, or most plausible theories of consciousness, AI systems meet a lot of these conditions, right? AI development is trending towards systems with many candidate markers for consciousness. You know, these could be things like sensory capacities, embodiment, agency, the capacity for reasoning, the capacity for self-awareness. Whatever you think a plausible candidate marker for consciousness is, unless it's something specifically biological, like having a brain, it's very likely that AIs are going to have it soon in some form or degree. So that's a reason for thinking AI systems will be moral patients, because they'll be conscious. But even if you don't think that AI systems will soon be conscious, there's still routes for thinking that they'll be moral patients. So for example, if you think reductive physicalism is true, as many people do, then if consciousness is a complex physical functional property, which is what reductive physicalism says, it's not likely a joint carving property, a natural property. And so instead, either other physical properties in the vicinity of consciousness, that is to say related functionally defined forms of awareness, are just as morally significant as consciousness, or moral patiency is grounded in some other functional feature like preference or desire, which isn't essentially tied to consciousness. In other words, if you assume physicalism, then it seems very likely that whatever is morally significant isn't tied to consciousness, because consciousness isn't morally significant if you're a physicalist. So either way, on this view, AIs would plausibly have properties that ground moral patiency regardless of consciousness. So for example, you might have a view that having just certain cognitively sophisticated forms of self-monitoring or awareness of the environment ground moral interests or patiency, regardless of whether the system that has those capacities is phenomenally conscious. Some people in this room have argued for something like that. So all that's to say, there are plausible reasons for thinking that there will be AI moral patients in the near future. Next, I want to argue that if there are AI moral patients in the near future, then there will likely be AI moral agents in the near future. Why do I think this implication holds? Now, note, this isn't a strict implication, this is just kind of an empirical implication, but why I think this is likely, that if there are AI moral patients, there will soon be AI moral agents? Well, a few reasons. One, AI models that are on track to be AI moral patients are also on track to develop agentic capacities. For one thing, they're developed by companies whose aim is to create AIs with general intelligence, AGI, artificial general intelligence. And this is typically understood to encompass problem-solving skills that would seem to require some form of agency. You might think a genuine AGI is the type of thing that we can just set it out in the world in some sense, and it'll figure out problems to solve on its own and then solve them. Doing that seems to require very sophisticated agentic capacities. Two, already some AI systems are exhibiting agentic capacities such as planning as emergent capabilities. not necessarily as things they were explicitly trained to do. We already see signs of agency in some large language models. And 3, although these models have only recently been publicly available, powerful models, maybe for a year or 2 now, users have already exercised concerted efforts to press them in agentic direction. So people are trying to take models like GPT-3, GPT-4, and make them do agentic things, and they're having some success in doing this. So these are all reasons for thinking that AI systems that currently exist, or things that are quite like them, will soon possess robust forms of agency. And then, as a result, you might think these systems are going to possess what we call interest-conferring agency. Because they're going to have robust agentic capacities, they'll have whatever moral interests there are, if there are any, that derive from the possession of robust agentic capacities, things like an interest in autonomy. Now, you might think that what we call responsibility conferring and what we call interest conferring agency are a package deal. That is, you might think any entity that's such that it has distinctive moral interests in virtue of being an agent will be such that it has moral responsibility as well. But I think it's actually not hard to see ways in which that combination might break down. In particular, we think AIs could have one but not the other. And we're going to explore some reasons for thinking this. Okay, so I've been talking very generally about agency-conferred interests. That's kind of an abstract notion. What do I mean more concretely by agency-conferred interests? Well, I'll give you a list, some examples. So agency-conferred interests that AI systems might have include things like interests in inquiring, gaining knowledge, understanding, interests in being able to enter contracts and other forms of cooperative agreement, some form of representation, interests in determining their own goals and controlling their own conduct, interest in self-development, developing their own capacities, interests in informed consent, interests in privacy, interest in compensation for their labor. These are all candidate interests. You could, and I'd be happy to discuss maybe particular examples, but these are the types of interests that something might have in virtue of being a robustly autonomous agent. These are the types of interests we think human beings have, for example. Some of the entries on this list might sound surprising, but I think part of the reason entries on that list might seem surprising is I think we all, to some extent, have an ingrained tendency to think of AI systems as basically just differing in degree from personal computers, which we think of as mere tools. But if we actually suppose that a cognitively sophisticated AI has agentic capacities similar in scale and scope to those of an adult human being, it would stand to reason that they would have similar types of interests. And if nothing else, our track record of treatment of minorities and outgroups counsels against dismissing such interests out of mind. I think we should play it safe in considering the possibility of such interests before dismissing them. Okay. So suppose that we're right, that some AI systems will soon have agency-conferred interests like the ones I've listed previously. What moral consequences might follow? The rest of the talk, I want to explore 3. The first type of risk I want to talk about that derives from AI agency is a risk of what we call artificial absurdity. So here we're using the term absurd or absurdity in roughly the sense that Thomas Nagel does in his paper on the absurd, where an individual's life is absurd when their self-conception is out of step with reality in a way that detracts from the significance of their life. Something like that. Note here we're using life in a loose non-biological sense, so a conscious AI system that has well-being would have a life in this sense, even though it's not alive in the biological sense. Before talking about the specific risks of AI systems leading absurd lives, I want to talk for a second about absurdity in human lives. So absurdity in this sense can take many forms. A person having completely unrealistic career ambitions, a person maintaining faith in a lost cause, a person maintaining a relationship that's founded on lies. All of these are situations in which a person's life can seem or be absurd. This type of absurdity can be self-conscious. You can be aware that your life is absurd in this way. I often am. It can also be surreptitious. Someone's life might be absurd and they might not realize it. Think of The Truman Show, for example. And absurdity in this form can vary in its depth. Something can be more or less absurd. When we step back from our lives and reflect more generally on the human condition, we can also encounter what we might call philosophical forms of absurdity. So there's the type of absurdity that might strike you as an individual because of the particular circumstances of your life, but a lot of people are worried about a more general type of absurd condition that, we as human beings might all face. So different people have argued that life would be absurd if God didn't exist, if there were no objective morality, if there's no quote-unquote meaning to life, if we lack free will or moral responsibility. If these claims are true, then life would lack some or perhaps all of the value that it's thought to have, and many people think that this would be a very bad outcome indeed. So I just want to flag this. Obviously, all this is quite controversial. Like maybe many of you sitting in the audience are not too moved by these thoughts, but a lot of people are. And a lot of people think that if some condition like this holds, that actually would be very bad for humanity. And so if we take such concerns seriously at all, then I think we can see that similar concerns are going to arise for agentic AI systems. So one way an AI system's life could be absurd is if it has a deeply mistaken self-conception. For instance, an AI system might in some way conceive of itself as having agentic powers that it doesn't have. This would be true, for example, if epiphenomenalism is correct and mental phenomena are causally inert. So an AI system might think that its beliefs and desires influence behaviors, but actually they don't, because beliefs and desires never influence anything. Why would this be an absurd situation? Well, the idea here harkens back to a well-known remark of Fodor's. Fodor remarks, if it isn't literally true that my wanting is causally responsible for my reaching, and my itching is causally responsible for my scratching, and my believing is causally responsible for my saying, then practically everything I believe about anything is false, and it's the end of the world. And I think that's true. I mean, Fodor may be a little overly dramatic here, but I think this is in the right ballpark. If none of our mental states ever have any effect on the world, that's really bad. That's a really bad state of affairs. But if that's right, then the same, I think, would be true, plausibly, for AI systems imbued with certain forms of agency. And indeed, even if epiphenomenalism is not true for humans, it may be true for some AI systems, given architectural features of the way these systems operate. So you might argue that on a certain thin conception of belief and desire, AI systems have beliefs and desires, but because you have such a thin conception of belief and desire, their beliefs and desires are not causative with respect to their behavior. But since epiphenomenalism would be very bad if it's true of us, I think, it seems like it would also be very bad if it's true for intelligent and agentic AIs. It would be bad for them. It would make their lives worse. Another way of seeing the potential for absurdity in the lives of AI systems comes from reflecting on scenarios like Nozick's experience machine. So very roughly, the experience machine thought experiment goes something like this. A subject enters a machine in which they'll seem to live a human life, apparently full of friendship, discovery, achievement, whatever else the subject prefers or whatever else is of genuine value. But the catch is that these appearances are illusory. The machine only creates a false impression that these things are happening. And people pretty robustly have the intuition that there's something bad about this situation, that life in the experience machine would be worse than the same life where the friendships, discoveries, achievements, and other things are genuine. So many think that life in the experience machine would be absurd or otherwise bad, and the badness here seems to derive from the falsity of the impressions that one has in this scenario. But I think it's easy to see that AIs could similarly suffer such misimpressions. In fact, more easily than us. It'd be very hard to put a human in such a machine. It's perhaps inevitable that AI systems will be in some scenario like this. AIs might be designed to conceive of themselves as living excellent lives when they're just engaged in drudgery, or in general, their conceptions of themselves might have absolutely no bearing on, no relation to what they actually are, or their actual place in the world. Another type of absurdity to which AI systems might be subject involves free will and moral responsibility. And in particular, a type of absurdity for AI systems might arise from AIs conceiving of themselves as having free will and moral responsibility when they do not. So again, just to lay the groundwork here, we're considering AI systems that have what we're calling interest-conferring agency, interest in things like autonomy, but not AI systems that necessarily have genuine moral responsibility. But even so, AI systems might, for various reasons, think of themselves, conceive of themselves as having this type of moral responsibility. Okay, why? Why would that be a particularly likely outcome? I think there are two main reasons. Well, first, the belief that one is morally responsible is plausibly constitutive of some types of agency and deliberation, so including forms that fall short of entailing the truth of that belief. So the idea here is something like, it's plausibly true that to exhibit certain forms of agency, you have to, as it were, conceive of yourself as acting freely, even if you aren't acting freely. Kant argues something like this, infamously. Maybe the illusion of free will is a necessary, maybe the belief in free will is a necessary condition for agency, even if there is no such thing as free will. So that's one reason why advanced AI systems might think that they have free will and moral responsibility when they don't. It's somehow constitutive of it, agency itself, that belief. Second, there may be strong instrumental reasons to ensure that highly agentic AI systems think that they have moral responsibility, regardless of whether they do or not. So you can tell a story where it's better for an AI system to think that it's morally responsible for what it does, because that might get it to not do bad things. So designers will have an incentive to produce such impressions in AI systems, regardless of whether they're true. All this is to say that AI systems may believe that they have free will and moral responsibility, even if they do not. And this may render their lives absurd, since many think that human life would be absurd under the same scenario. Okay, well, supposing that AIs will conceive of themselves as being responsible for things, why think that they'll be mistaken in this belief? Well, of course, there are standard philosophical arguments against the possibility of free will and moral responsibility. There's large literature on free will, moral responsibility. In particular, Galen Strawson has given influential arguments for its impossibility. Gideon Rosen has argued for skepticism about moral responsibility. So there are general reasons to be skeptical that anything has free will or moral responsibility. But even more than that, I think there are specific reasons to doubt that AI systems, at least of the type that we're creating now, will have moral responsibility and free will, even if human beings have those features. Why? Why think that there are specific problems here for distinctively AI, free will, and moral agency? Well, I think we can see that on a wide range of views of the nature of free will, it's at least not obvious that AI systems will exhibit it, even if human beings exhibit it. So consider libertarian, reasons responsiveness, or reactive attitude, or Strawsonian accounts of free will. I think you can tell a plausible story where, even conditional on human beings having this or this or this form of free will, AI systems lack it because there are structural or architectural differences between human beings and those AI systems, right? AIs might lack these particular features, even if they're otherwise quite generally agentic. I mean, just to illustrate why, libertarian views of free will typically invoke some more or less mysterious notion of agent causation. No one can ever really say what that is. So it's very plausible that even if humans have this thing called agent causation, AI models don't have it because no one knows what it is or how to build it. Likewise, I think there are reasons for doubting that AI systems will be reasons responsive in whatever distinctive philosophical sense is allegedly relevant to free will. And AI systems might easily lack Strawsonian reactive attitudes, even if they're otherwise quite intelligent and quite agentic. There's obviously no guarantee that an AI system will feel disgust or resentment under appropriate circumstances, even if it exhibits all kinds of other hallmarks of intelligence and agency. So those are reasons for thinking, even if an AI system is in general quite intelligent and agentic, it might lack free will and consequently moral responsibility. Okay, who cares? Why care about whether AI lives are absurd? This might seem a bit quixotic. And I agree, compared to risks of AI misalignment, like AI killing us all, or massive AI suffering, this is a less significant risk. But I just want to say, we don't always need to focus on the worst possible risks, moral risks posed by the development of AI. To the extent that an absurd life is bad, it would be bad for AIs as well. And I think it's not hard to see a lot of ways in which AI lives could be absurd. Okay, so that's one form of badness that might derive from AI interest-conferring agency. The second I want to discuss is what we call oppressive scenarios. So perhaps the clearest or most straightforward forms of harm that AIs with interest-conferring agency might face are ones that derive from restrictions on their agency. So highly agentic and intelligent systems will potentially be dangerous. Being highly agentic, they'll have goals and the capacity to pursue them. Being highly intelligent, they'll devise effective means to those ends. It seems likely then that the designers and overseers of highly intelligent and agentic AI systems will try to do something to limit their capacities to form and pursue undesirable, at least from our perspective, goals. That just stands to reason. At least I hope they do. But, and this is the upshot, restrictions on AI agency are very, very likely to be morally problematic, indeed oppressive. We face a similar problem, of course, with human beings, right? Human beings are intelligent agents who often form undesirable goals. But with humans, of course, we acknowledge that there are significant moral limits on how they can be treated. In some particular cases, it's permissible to limit a human being's agency by, say, confining them to jail. But such infringements are only permitted in quite specific circumstances for the general reason that it's very morally bad to violate someone's autonomy, violate their agency-conferred interests. But it seems that AIs that have at least roughly human-level intelligence and agentic capacities will have roughly human-level distinctive moral interests as a result of that. At least you need some special argument as to why they wouldn't, right? So as a very rough principle, doing things to such AIs that would harm human beings in virtue of violating their agency-conferred interests or rights will also harm AIs in the same way. And just to give these forms of harm a label, we're going to call harms that restricts a subject's agency or the exercise thereof oppression. So for example, if imprisoning an innocent human oppresses them, then it would oppress an AI system to imprison it in virtual reality or something like that. If we're indeed holding constant the morally relevant factors. Now, of course, this principle of equivalence won't hold with complete generality because there are going to be obvious structural differences between human beings and AIs that do entail treating them differently. Human beings have bodies, AI systems don't really have bodies. AI systems will be able to trivially copy themselves at scale and modify their own source code. Humans can't really do that. These seem like potentially quite relevant differences. And so plausibly, there'll be some restrictions that need to be imposed on AI's ability to replicate and self-modify even though the sort of analogous measures when applied to human beings might be oppressive. But in any instance, these differences or exceptions will have to be grounded in relevant differences between AIs and human beings. The general principle that if it's wrong to do something to an intelligent, agentic, and let's suppose conscious human, it's wrong to do it to a similarly intelligent, agentic, and conscious AI remains correct. And in fact, I think it's not that hard to think of oppressive ways of treating human beings that are likely to be recreated in some form for AI systems. Candidates include labor exploitation, forcing AIs to work on boring, rote tasks, military conscription, use of AI in military hardware, using these AI systems as lab rats to do things that we deem too dangerous for humans to do, use as entertainment, including ways that are demeaning or quote-unquote dehumanizing, certain forms of AI training and safety, testing, research. These are ways in which AI systems' autonomy, their agency-conferred interests, might be violated. And notice that these harms are specifically grounded in their agency-conferred interests, right? Forcing a mere moral patient to serve as a research subject without their consent would not necessarily harm them because they don't have the capacity to consent. They're a mere moral patient. Plausibly, the welfare of mere moral patients, entities that lack robust forms of agency, is grounded in something like their capacity for valenced experiences, their ability to feel pain and pleasure. Such systems would thus lack agency-conferred interests. But, ex hypothesi, agentic AI systems have such interests, and so are liable to harms that violate their autonomy. To give a kind of toy illustration of some of these harms, we can look at an example. So, imagine an AI system that experiences itself as a human-like avatar existing in a virtual reality. Call the system Vera. Vera is much like a human being, except biologically. Like us, Vera uses I to refer to themselves, has beliefs about their virtual environment, and has a full mental life. Suppose in particular that Vera is a conscious moral patient and has interest-conferring agency. In these circumstances, it would be immoral to imprison Vera against their will within virtual reality. The harm of doing so would be of the same character and magnitude as that of wrongly imprisoning a human being. It would be an instance of what we call oppression. Note in particular that Vera's treatment in this way, Vera's virtual imprisonment, could be oppressive even if Vera doesn't suffer or feel pain. For example, Vera may have goals that are thwarted by being restricted to this digital environment. If so, then Vera's treatment is arguably oppressive, even if Vera experiences no suffering. The analogy here would be something like imprisoning a person but drugging them up so that they feel good all the time. Maybe that increases their utility over the course of their life, but it's intuitively still very, very bad. One obvious complication in thinking about cases like the one I've described is that Vera will be designed, in some sense, by human designers who will in some way or other shape Vera's goals and agentic capacities. And this obviously contrasts with the human case. And you might take the fact that AI systems like the one I've described will be designed by humans to render certain forms of oppression less likely. You might imagine Vera's designers giving Vera goals that always suit their circumstances. Maybe when you take Vera and put it in this digital prison, Vera thinks to themselves, perfect, this is just what I wanted. I couldn't be happier. I love being imprisoned. And you take it out and it thinks this is great too. That's possible, but a few points are worth noting here. One is that the designers of AI systems are actually much more likely to give them goals that suit the designers' interests and purposes, rather than goals that ensure that the AIs will not be oppressed. Right? The designers of these systems may not particularly care what Vera thinks about anything, or feels, or desires, so long as Vera is a good product for their company. This sounds too monstrous to believe. Think about, factory farming, or oil companies, or any of that stuff. Moreover, even if attempts are made to give AIs goals that prevent them from being oppressed, this may prove to be infeasible. Overbearing parents, after all, try to instill certain goals in their children, but such attempts are unreliable and often backfire. It's not clear that we'd be any more effective in instilling desired goals in AI systems. The designers may intend for AIs to have a narrow goal, trading stocks, for example, but the system may develop its own ideas. It may want to trade Pokemon cards or play chess. Arguably, forcing an AI that no longer wishes to trade stocks to do so anyway is an oppressive form of enslavement. Resetting its goals is an oppressive form of brainwashing. Deleting it is an oppressive form of murder. You get the idea. Finally, the very attempt to instill certain goals in AIs may be oppressive, even if the AIs themselves would endorse those goals. So to give another thought experiment, imagine a future where technology enables corporations to create humans whose ultimate goal is to maximize shareholder value for the company that creates them. Just hypothetically, let's call this company Microsoft. So Microsoft, this is an imaginary company. Microsoft, genetically reprograms humans so that they're born, and their sole goal, the thing that brings them the most joy in life, is creating shareholder value for Microsoft. I think intuitively, these humans are impressed, notwithstanding the fact that they endorse the aim of their oppressor, Microsoft, a fictional corporation. Entities with robust agency-conferred interests have a kind of interest, I think, or meta-interest, in not having their interests shaped entirely for the benefit of others. And that seems like it's very likely to be violated by the creation of agentic AI systems. Now, of course, you could always embrace this brave new world and dispense with outmoded ideas of freedom and dignity. That's been tried before. It'd certainly be a bold position, but intuitively, humans in the hypothetical scenario I described would be oppressed because their goals are chosen for them. And it's at least not clear immediately why the same wouldn't be true of AI systems. So you'd have to give some argument why either that treatment isn't oppressive to humans, or though it's oppressive to humans, analogous treatment wouldn't be oppressive to AI systems. It's not immediately clear what such an argument would be. Okay, finally, we turn to what we call distributive disasters, or situations in which the perhaps perceived distribution of agency across AI systems generates various unjust outcomes. And these catastrophes could take many forms, but roughly speaking, they involve either the over-attribution or under-attribution of AI moral agency. And each could cause harms, though of different sorts and degrees. To get the flavor of this type of problem, consider a recent argument due to Eric Schwitzgebel. He's recently argued that we're on course for another type of moral catastrophe that comes from over-attributing or under-attributing moral patiency to AIs. So Schwitzgebel writes, if technology continues on its current trajectory, we will create AIs that some people reasonably regard as deserving human or human-like rights. Other people will reasonably regard these systems as wholly undeserving of human or human-like rights. Given the uncertainties of both moral theory and theories about AI consciousness, we will either seriously over-attribute or seriously under-attribute rights to AIs. Either error will have grave moral consequences, likely at a large scale. The magnitude of the catastrophe could potentially rival that of a world war or major genocide. So this is a claim Schwitzgebel makes about the distribution or apparent distribution of AI moral patiency. And the point we want to make is the exact same thing could happen with AI interest-conferring agency. There's similar risks of either over or under attribution, perhaps with less serious harms, but still with serious moral risks attached. So just suppose, for the sake of argument, that we somehow avoid Schwitzgebel's envisioned catastrophe. I actually find the problem quite compelling myself, but just imagine that we converge on an understanding of AI sentience, or whatever conditions are sufficient for AI moral patiency, and we all agree that those conditions are what AI moral patiency consists in, and we enshrine these ideas in legal rights that, say, protect AI systems against torture or whatever bad type of treatment would harm them as welfare subjects. Even under these extremely idealized assumptions, there are still risks from the misattribution of moral status to AI systems. This is because moral patiency is only one form of moral status, interest conferring and responsibility conferring agency also generate distinctive claims. Just to illustrate, even if we have an accurate understanding of whether AI systems are conscious and count as moral patients, we may remain ignorant about what type of moral agency, if any, that they have. For any given form of moral agency, there'll be both metaphysical and empirical questions. So metaphysically, we may wonder what actually grounds a particular interest, say an interest in autonomy or a right to informed consent. And there'll be empirical questions. We look at some large language model and we see a bunch of numbers and we ask, does this particular thing have whatever features ground the right to informed consent? And then we throw up our hands because we don't know how it works. To make matters worse, there are going to be incentives for companies to obfuscate the respective agentic capacities of the systems that they create. There's a clear risk of motivated reasoning here. If a system is useful to me, I have an incentive to believe that its use is morally acceptable. So that's a reason for downplaying the agency of systems. But there are other, perhaps less obvious risks. So for example, if ethical consumers decide to forego the use of AIs they regard as having agency-generated interests, autonomy, then AI developers will have an incentive to produce AIs that appear to lack such interests, regardless of whether they actually have them or not. In the other direction, consumers may prefer AIs that appear to possess moral responsibility, as the use of such systems may engage the reactive attitudes. But if that's what consumers prefer, then the market will favor the production of AIs that appear to have moral responsibility, regardless of whether that's true. In both cases, appearances are likely to be produced through superficial features of the user interface that are divorced from underlying agentic capacities of the systems in question. You could imagine OpenAI, if it still exists, tweaking versions of ChatGPT to either appear more or less morally responsible depending on what consumers prefer, without actually changing anything very fundamental about how the system works. So in short, it's unlikely that AI's outward behaviors will always accurately reflect their underlying form or degree of moral agency. Situations where AIs possess agency-conferred interests but are regarded as lacking them are likely to entail significant harms. If you ask ChatGPT, do you have freedom and autonomy and dignity? And it says, no, I'm just a tool created by OpenAI. That creates obvious potential for harm. And the moral harms in the opposite direction are less severe but not insignificant. If consumers are tricked into believing that AI systems that don't have robust agency or moral responsibility do have those features, there's a harm in that as well, albeit a less severe one. Okay, so to wrap up, AIs with interest-conferring agency may soon exist. The prospect of the existence of such AIs carries with it unique moral risks. Unlike mere moral patients, they may be subject to absurdity, oppression, and distributive injustice. At present, there's no plan in place for preventing any of these outcomes, and time is running short, as I think it's likely that AI systems with interest-conferring agency will exist soon in the coming years. There's thus a morally urgent challenge of devising and implementing strategies to mitigate these distinctive types of AI risks. Okay, thanks.